And we're finally live. Wow, that was a little bit more delay than I'm used to. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. But without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. Stephen Oliver, introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers.
Hi, my name's Stephen Oliver. I'm a British writer, and I've published one or two books, and I believe we're going to talk about one of them this evening.
Absolutely, and everyone's going to love your accent. So where in the United Kingdom are you?
I don't know how well people know the UK. I live just outside Peterborough, which is about 45 miles away from Cambridge.
Okay.
I'm on the eastern middle bit of England.
Okay, so we've interviewed a couple British authors, and one of them I had convinced that everyone in America believes that all of England is London, and she was like, "Wait, they really think that?" And we went with it for the whole time before she realized I was joking. So, but yeah, it's the amazing thing is somebody once told me that most of England landmass would fit in Texas. And when
Pretty much, yeah.
How you can drive from one end to the other.
Mm.
So. Do you get to travel around the country a lot, or are you pretty much landlocked to where you're at?
Where I am, well, basically, I don't go very far. I look after my mother. She's 90 years old, has had a hip operation, so she's not particularly mobile. So I spend most of my time basically looking after her when I'm not writing. But fortunately, she's still fairly low maintenance, so I get plenty of time to write.
Absolutely. Speaking of the introduction, so the next part, dear listener, is how we first found them. Actually, I was looking for guests that were kind of a little different, breaking up the monotony of the same type of books we interview. And when I mentioned that to his publisher, he's like, "I've got just the person for you." And he said, since my first publisher was from the UK, I know how to talk to you British types. So the rest is history. But I do have to ask, because I've asked this to a lot of the authors that write from the United Kingdom, given all of the castles and whatnot, the history that inspires most of fantasy, what drew you to writing what you do instead of, being the next Tolkien?
Well, basically, I've been writing for 10 years, but for the 45 odd years before that, I've been a science fiction reader, starting off with Bradbury and Heinlein and Asimov, progressing later on to horror and fantasy, Tolkien, Donaldson, and then on to Lovecraft and Kuntz and so on. So basically, they say write what you know, and as far as I'm concerned, that's what I know, what I've been reading for 55 years.
Okay. So do you ever plan on branching out to writing some fantasy as well?
Well, fantasy, I am actually working on an epic fantasy. I've got 108,000 words done. There's probably another 50,000 to come. But that's taking a little bit longer because I discovered the joys of the short story and the novella, which, of course, is much easier because you don't have to plan quite so far ahead. And for someone like me who's a pantser, I don't like planning at all.
Okay, that's fair. And while we, dear listener, have ditched the script, we do have certain questions we have to ask. So, sir, are you ready for the religion question?
Yep.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Any or all of the above. I've never actually seen Firefly, but I've seen lots of comments about it. I used to love watching Star Trek. I've loved the Star Wars films. Basically, I'm agnostic. As long as it's a good film with a good story, I'm in.
So what are your feelings on Doctor Who, given that it's the most iconic sci-fi franchise that comes out of your country?
Oh, I love Doctor Who, although I must admit I haven't enjoyed it so much in recent years. Going back to the classic, you'd have a story that will be 3 or 5 or 6 episodes long, each half an hour, which meant it was spread over a long time, but you got more development of the storyline. If you're dealing with the Daleks, you can do multiple tracks, as it were. Now it's always over in an hour, and that, I'm afraid, doesn't make it quite so exciting. So I rather lost interest because the I don't know, for want of a better word, the complexity seems to have gone.
So you prefer where the plot is continues on. I mean, you don't mind episodic as long as the plot doesn't end at that episode, right? Is that what you're saying?
No. That was fine because it actually dragged you in, because you're then spending a week with your friends saying, "Oh, what's going to happen now?"
Yeah. Okay. I prefer episodic, but I like it when, like the series will continue. So what happened this week matters next week.
Mm-hmm.
And an expert move would be if they can do that and still let you jump in at any point and still understand what's going on. Like
exactly. But the later ones, each story seemed to be, there was a continuing story going on about the Doctor and the companions, but there wasn't a story from week to week. It's not a continuing story in that respect. It's sort of a little bit jumpy around. So they used to say wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite Doctor?
Not really. I mean, I've enjoyed them all because each of them is quirky in their own way, but at the same time, you've got to remember this is the same person, just different aspects of their personality. I suppose in a way, it's like the main character's got DID.
Yeah, I can see that. So, because we're polytheistic, we can't just ask the sci-fi question. So, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Lord of the Rings?
I have only ever seen Lord of the Rings. I've only ever read the Tolkien. I have never read the others, mainly because I don't have the time, quite honestly. Yeah, I'm too busy writing my own stuff nowadays. Ever since I stopped working.
Okay, so are you writing every day, or do you tend to go in binges and spurts? And what's your process?
Yes. There are times, well, I try to write every day, but of course, being in the phases I'm now in, a lot of the time is editing, submissions. I'm starting to look into the marketing side of things. So, I have a lot of time spent in working on a website, on tweeting, on trying to set up marketing materials, on media kits and all this sort of thing. So those days I'm not really getting much writing done, but there are other times when I will suddenly have a blitz of lightning in my head and bingo, there I am. And I'll sit down and I'll write 5,000-6,000 words in a day. Depending on how things are going. I mean, case in point, I did a short story, 2,500 words, and I ended with a cliffhanger. And a friend of mine read it and said, "Well, where's the rest of the story?" I said, "There is none." He said, "I want the rest of that story because there's got to be something." So I then sat down over the next 3 days. I had another 12,000 words.
Okay, so
and got a complete story out of it, and it's going back to sort of golden age of fantasy, science fiction, where the hero's running around with a blaster and a sword, wearing weird armor, sort of Flash Gordon.
Yeah. So what is it overall that draws you to the genre of speculative fiction? So all the things, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, like all of that umbrella. What is it that initially draws you in?
What draws me in is possibility. The fact that it shows that the world isn't dull and mediocre the way it often seems. You look around, and it's grey and horrible. And this is where things happen, where people can actually go out and change things in weird and spectacular ways. Just thinking of some of my characters, what they do in various stories, it's quite interesting, that they are much more action heroes than I've ever been. I did discover 4.5 years ago why I've never been a man of action, and that's because I've had a heart condition all my life.
Well, we're glad you're with us, even with a heart condition, then, because we wouldn't have these books.
Yeah, they operated on me back in 2018. Gave me an artificial valve in my aorta, and conditions have looked much better since then. I've also found I've been more creative since then as well.
So You've been a lifelong lover of speculative fiction, starting with science fiction. What made you decide to transition from I really like sci-fi to man, I really want to tell stories in that space?
Well, I've always been developing ideas. I mean, it, I was blocked for over 4 decades by something that a teacher once said to me. We, over the summer vacation, we'd had to do a multi-chapter story, and I wrote a science fiction story about a grand tour of the solar system. And when he was handing it all out, it was, uh, nice story about visiting your grandparents. I'm glad you learned how to sail a boat or whatever. And then he came to me and he said, Stephen, stop writing this science fiction rubbish. Never do it again. And it blocked me for many, many years. I had ideas. I have a 4-part young adult fiction, sort of high adventure, hard science fiction, which even then had already been developing in the back of my mind, and that got blocked for many, many years. And now, I mean, I have a thing which I keep next to my desk. It's a post-it note, and it says, "Screw you, Mr. Dutton." And that was the name of the teacher, by the way. Because nowadays I've realized how I get around the mental scar he created was to write good science fiction, not rubbish science fiction.
Okay. Well, I mean, teachers inspire us in many ways, and clearly not all of it's good, but we'll take what we can get.
Exactly.
Hopefully, teachers now are not doing that to readers.
Maybe.
I hope. I have to be positive. I know my kids' school, they encourage them to be creative. So
that's good.
So what was the first? You said science fiction was how you discovered the genre. What was the first sci-fi property that you think you found, and what venue was it? Like comic book, TV, whatever.
It was 2 books. I'd got a prize at school. One of these things, you're the best in class, whatever subject it is, and then you got a little thing that allowed you to buy books up to a value of a particular thing. And I was wandering around the shop, and I came across 2 books by Ray Bradbury, R is for Rocket and S is for Space. And I thought those look interesting, and I picked them up, and I've been hooked ever since.
Okay. Do you recommend those books to readers now? Do you think they aged, or were
they have aged a bit? I mean, Bradbury has a great style, but this is some of his earlier work. The Martian Chronicles, for instance, I find much better. That's much more mature writing, even though he's got this slightly weird religious overtone to it somehow.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Do you prefer to have sort of, I guess, non-religious, non-political themes in your stuff? Like, do you care that they're there, or?
No, not at all. In fact, I'm writing. I did a short story last year for a competition called Confessional, which is basically about an authoritarian theocracy controlling the world. Somebody read that and told me, I like your story, but the information is just so dense in there. Can't you loosen it up? So now I'm working on a novella based on the same thing. But as I say at the beginning of the novella, it's the same characters, but it's not the same story. It's from somewhere else in the multiverse where the same characters are interacting differently, but in a similar situation. And that's got religious overtones. I don't have anything against religion per se. What I really don't like is when someone uses science fiction to shove religion down my throat. That's when I start getting a little bit uptight about it, I must admit.
Okay. So you prefer when it fits organically in the story instead of being ham-fisted.
Exactly.
Okay. So do you think that there was any one moment that sort of, if you had to pick a moment in time, affects the way you tell stories? Do you think it was that moment with your teacher?
I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I have been writing all my life. I was a software engineer for over 30 years. So
Okay.
there you have to be capable of clear thinking and precise language. And I think that sort of built itself into my psyche. And then along came the ideas for science fiction. My muse, as it were, took hold of me. I started writing a novel that's an epic fantasy, and then I made a major mistake because I'm a pantser. I let the stories develop themselves organically and then tidy them up in the editing phase. In this case, I came across a book called Take Off Your Pants, which is turning pantsers into plotters. And I did exactly what they said for my novel. And at 35,000 words, it was dead in the water because I got the character arcs and plot arcs and secondary plot arcs and, all this sort of thing. And I just couldn't write anymore. And it was only when somebody said to me, your problem is your subconscious thinks you finished writing the story. Then I had to abandon everything. But in the meantime, I'd had an idea for a story which wouldn't have fitted in the novel anyway, and went and took that. It's a fairly short story, about 7,500 words. And I realized when I'd finished writing it, I had created an entire narrative universe where I could fit all of my story ideas in that I had fantasy, I had science fiction, I had horror, and I could fit in fact, I can fit almost anything in there. And that was Paranormal City, which is the name I've given to the place where most of these stories happen. And I finished that, and I almost immediately had another idea for a story, and then another, and another. And before I knew it, I had an entire book.
Okay. That's good. I mean, that you figured out a way that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're relatively new to professionally writing, to putting things out there for other people to read. So are there any specific milestones you're most excited to experience? Be it autographs, cosplay, fan art, meeting characters, meeting your readers? Like what's the one thing that you're most looking forward to on that journey?
What I was or what I am looking forward to?
Either one.
Either one.
You're relatively new to time.
One of the most exciting ones was actually getting a publisher, an indie publisher, saying, we like your story, we'd like to publish it, and sending me a contract. I looked at the contract, I talked it over with my writing coach. I now have a writing coach. And she looked at it with an agent, and the three of us discussed. And I said, I'd like to change this. I'm not happy with that. And they said, yeah, okay. And bingo, it was done. Because I did have a company that had a contract that was a horrendous contract. They basically had full control of anything and everything. They didn't even, if you read it carefully, they didn't even actually have to pay me any royalties if they didn't want to. So I told them where to stuff that. But getting an actual contract and something where I can sign it and send it back and know that in a couple of months my book's going to be out, that was such an exciting experience for me.
Okay, that's an important one. So what all do you have out at the moment? We mentioned Paranormal City. Or do you have other things that are published already, or was that your first one?
Well, Paranormal City, actually, although it was the first contract, it was the second book. There's another book of mine called Shuttlers, which is a standalone episodic novel. Space opera, basically interreality warfare. A shuttler is someone who can move between realities just by an act of will. I have various psychic abilities in that universe, and that's come out. People like it. But the funny thing is that my muse wouldn't let me go, and I'm already nearly 30,000 words into the sequel to that. The same as Paranormal City, the second book is at the publishers. It's just been through the editing phase. I'm now waiting for them to come back to talk about things like the cover design and all that sort of thing, with a new contract, of course.
So you have
and then there's 2 more of Paranormal City finished and ready to go. I'm working on the 5th volume. I'm working on 8 offshoots, the way that NCIS is an offshoot of JAG. I've got, sort of about various aspects of the world, like the fairies, the reapers, and all that sort of thing. So taking all in all, I've got 5 books completed. And 5 books completed, and another 18 I'm working on.
Holy garbage! You're working on all of them at once? Do you just like?
No, I've split between the thing. You see, I've discovered people keep talking about writer's block. I've never had that, and I think the reason is because I usually have multiple projects on the same time. If I get blocked on one, I now know from experience it's because my subconscious, my muse, whatever you want to call it, hasn't developed the story yet. So it's saying, stop, I can't go anymore here, don't try and push it. And so I switched to something else. I may have a couple of dozen stories going at any one time, and I can sit down with one of the others where I suddenly know, I know where I'm going with this now. As I said, I'm a pantser, so often I don't know where I'm going, and then suddenly I'll realize what the next sentence is and the one after that, and then it's flow, and a couple of thousand words later, I can say, right, well, I've got that one finished, put it aside and come back and edit it next week. And so my way of working is perhaps a little bit chaotic. I mean, I remember years ago when I was still working in software design, a colleague said to me, I know you're creative because your desk is always such a mess. And that's sometimes how I work. But the thing is, I can jump. Because I can jump, I can carry all these storylines in my head without any trouble, because in many ways, a lot of the stories interact. I'll have a character in this story who is a cameo, but he was a main character in another story, or will become a main character in another story. So I have, I've got this world where people are interacting with each other. Where this guy's a detective, he had his story, but now he's supporting somebody else. And then the person he's supporting then becomes a character in another story. And the pathologist who's been working with both of them suddenly gets his story. And that's the way it works. These people develop and grow inside my head. I don't know if that means I've got schizophrenia or something, but it certainly means I have a lot of ideas because I know how this world works.
Okay, that makes sense. So, but all of it seems to be in the same world, right?
Most of them are. The epic novel doesn't exist in that world as such. And the 4-part young adult that I've been thinking of for years doesn't really belong in that universe either, because it's more science fiction.
Okay. So you've mentioned that there are 5 books out in the direct line of the Paranormal City universe. How many do you see in the overall universe? Like how many, well, not the universe, in that direct story arc? Because obviously if you're writing other series in the same world, they would be listed as other series. But in the main series that we're talking about, the Paranormal Cities, the start of, how long do you see that arc going?
I don't know how long it's going to go, because I keep getting ideas. I'm on the 5th volume at the moment, but that's just because of the way the stories have grown. A bit like the world itself, things are a little bit chaotic. Somebody may look at it and try to work out what the timeline is. Good luck to them. I don't think they're going to find one. But the whole point is, there are stories which, when an idea comes to me, I'll start writing it in Paranormal City, and then I suddenly realize, no, that actually belongs in one of the other books. So I then move it across, no problem at all. But I'm on the 5th book. How many more are there depends, I think, less on how many I plan to do, and more on how long I'm going to survive, because my intention is to stop writing when they peel my cold, dead fingers off the keyboards.
So when you write, do you write with the keyboard? Do you dictate somewhere in between? Like, what's your, like, how do you do it?
It depends on mood. There are times when I love the feel of typing, the tactile feel. There are other times when the story is coming out so fast that I need to dictate. So what I use is Dragon to dictate it, because that seems to understand my accent better. So I use that. But it seems to be getting very slow nowadays, so I may have to switch to another software. But it depends very much on how I'm feeling at the time. Because there are times when I can write 1,800 words in an hour, and there are other times when I'm lucky to get 100 words out in the same time.
Okay. I know some authors that for whatever reason they want to be retro, and they're like, oh, I type on a keyboard or like a typewriter.
No.
No, I don't need that torture.
No, not only that, but of course, I taught myself back in my teens at school. I taught myself touch typing, 10-finger system, using a book called Teach Yourself 10-Finger Typing, and I've been typing ever since, which was of course great. As a software engineer, it meant I could write all my specifications, my programs, my training materials, my handbooks. I could get them out quickly and easily. That's the thing. But no, right. And what about these people who insist they've got to write it all by hand? I get writer's cramp just writing the odd note.
Yeah, I've just going through when I was like signing the contracts for some of the anthologies I've done, my hands started cramping, and I'm just, ooh, I don't know how. Obviously, we went through school and we wrote everything by hand, but doing it now, it's just like, oh, my arm feels like it's going to fall off. This is insane. So yeah, I don't know. I know Marco Cluse, at least he used to. He writes military science fiction. He used to write it by hand and then type it, and then he got a program that he wrote it by hand on a screen that then translated it into text type. But even he mentioned that's too slow at this point. He types it on a computer to speed up.
Well,
but
you say about writer's cramp way back in 1990. I was taking a degree as a systems analyst, and it was 3 days of torture because we were writing for 3 days, pretty much non-stop, 7.5 hours a day. And so by the end of 3 days, I thought I will never be able to type again, let alone write.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I think 3 minutes will do it.
Well, we're at a natural pause point, so I'm going to pause for a moment, dear listener, where we shamefully shill for the woman this time. So we're going to play that commercial, and then we'll jump back and we'll start talking more specifically about Paranormal City.
In a world where magic is controlled by law and government, mages are both coddled and persecuted. Corey Monroe knows she isn't a mage, and her best friend is. Reality isn't always what you know. If you are looking for an urban fantasy with found family, an education-based magic system, and evolving storylines, try My Luck by Mel Todd, book 1 in the Twisted Luck series, available exclusively on Amazon.
Okay. Well, thank you for sticking with us through that commercial interlude, dear listener, dear viewer. With that being said, we were talking and starting to get more specific about Paranormal City. So first off, the cover, right? So you said you had a say in how the cover was designed. So what is the story of what we're looking at with this? Looks like the Aurora Borealis, and it looks like an older city because I'm seeing cobblestone. So what's the story here?
But the story here actually is my cover design. I had my own cover design, mainly because I use my Kindle Fire as an editing tool. I will read the book when I'm doing editing and revision. I'll read there and make notes there. And so, of course, I needed different covers to differentiate the various books I was working on inside my Kindle. So I had the design, and it was a city skyline, a silhouette, with water reflecting underneath, and there were flames coming out against the green sky. And they said, all very nice, but we need something a bit more modern looking. But they kept the green.
Okay.
That's where it comes from, and it's somebody going down a city. By the way, I've had a look at the original picture. I believe it's 1935 Berlin.
Oh,
Because if you read the text carefully, it's actually in High German. And then they found this character, and yeah,
okay.
yeah, that is actually there. It's there's more on the back. There's more on the back cover where it says Zimmer frei, which means rooms available.
So, what is the Writers Forum award that you got?
Writers Forum is an online forum on Facebook. There's about 115,000 members there now, and they did a book of the year earlier this year. And basically, you sent in your manuscript, and I said, okay, no problem. I actually sent in 2 manuscripts, the other being for my other book, Shuttlers. And then imagine my surprise when now 3 months later, I got an email from the head judge and saying, you've won, you've got first prize. And I said, thank you very much. Which book? And he said, both books. And I went, what? And it turned out they'd liked both books so much they couldn't decide. They apparently had long discussions which book should be first. And in the end, they said, damn it, we'll just put both of them in first prize. And this is just one of those 2 books. Obviously, I made a real impression on them. By the way, that character there, I hadn't actually described one of my characters, Michael Sana. He's in the first book, and he looked so much like what I imagine the man must look that I've actually modified the story to include his beard and moustache now and his long hair, because I hadn't actually described him. I leave description up to my my readers, because I found their imaginations are usually much better than mine.
That is the modern trend these days to do that. I prefer to have all the descriptions, but I understand the market right now. That is the trend to do that. But I dig it. So is the leather coat that he's wearing, the leather trench coat, factored into the novel as well?
No, it hasn't, but I don't actually describe it. It's in the second book. I talk about him in a suit, with a shirt with an open collar and the tie hanging down and the hat pulled over his eyes and so on. Sort of giving a noir feel to the character, because the feeling I had when I was writing that particular story, although it was fantasy, because I mean the guy had magical powers, but there was a noir feeling to it as I wrote it. There are other stories I'm doing which also have the noir feel. That's something I used to love reading way back when.
Okay. Okay. So what can you tell us about your main character?
Well, there is no main character per se. The main character is actually the city.
Okay.
In fact, at the beginning, I sort of say, this is the city. It could be any city. It might even be your city. Give a little bit of a description. And then I say everyone will be telling their story. And literally all the stories that are in there are in the first person. But each of them has a different feel to it, because each character has their own voice. One will have a slightly more clipped military feel to it because they're a Marine. Another one will be, what's the best way to describe it? Let's say an uneducated hick, but that's actually a boogeyman. And so on. And then right at the end, spoiler alert, right at the end, the very last story is written by the city itself, explaining what has happened. And the city is basically, it's the primary character, and everyone else is playing bit parts in the city's story. And that's how it goes over the books I've written. It's the people, but it's always how they're interacting within the city.
Okay. So what can you tell us then, since the city is the main character, about the city?
Well, it's I don't actually name it. It's a metropolitan place, and there is a small section within it that I call Dark Town, and that's where, for the most part, the supernatural, the unnatural, the weird, the strange, and everyone congregate out of the view of the mundanes, although some of the mundanes will know what's going on. Police, for instance, maybe priests, they will know that there's something going on there, but they prefer, almost like ghetto thinking, they prefer, look, if you're going to do your magic or your vampirism or whatever, you keep it going in your own little neck of the woods and keep away from us. And so the core of the city, as it were, is Dark Town, where most of the weird people live and have their being. I've even got sort of strange names. There's Bloodletter Lane, where the vampires congregate, and Nyarlathotep Avenue, which is the main avenue going down through it, and so on, just to give this weird feeling about it. But it's dark. Let's just be honest. Most of the stories can be pretty dark, even if they are triumphant at the end.
Okay. Do you have a concept of the origin of this world, where the paranormal in the, I guess, normal, the reality sort of meshed? Like, was there a defining moment that said, on this day, I don't know, asteroid passed by, unlocked something, whatever it happens to be? Is there a defining moment, or in this world, it's just always like that?
No, there isn't. As I point out in the introduction, every city, every town, perhaps even every village has its own version of Dark Town, the place where the strange things live and have their being. And they've always been there. They've always been hiding. In some ways, it's almost as though they are there and the rest of the city grows and accretes around them. They are the core, and everything else is just humanity trying to live their lives around this strange central section of their reality.
So do you lean into you? It sounds a little dark. Are we talking Lovecraftian? Is it more just, dark fantasy? Like, what is the vibe of this universe and this story specifically?
It sort of wavers a little bit back between the two. I actually, one of my offshoot books, my working title is Lovecraftian, and that's where I've got the darkest stories, with Shoggoths and the King in Yellow, and all those sort of horror things. They have their own book, because I don't want to keep them within the main book, as it were, because I want to have a little bit lightness in there. I mean, there is, in Paranormal City, the longest story is A Quest Through Hell, which is successful with the help of a rather unusual rescuer, so to speak. But I'll leave the reader up to find out all about that.
Quest Through Hell. So
but
what?
You're right. It is dark. My fantasies tend to go quite dark, and in fact, I was doing a writing prompt with a writing group, and after 20 minutes, we were reading out our bits. So I read mine out, and someone said that went dark very, very quickly. In other stories, it doesn't go dark until, and this is where the pantser in me comes out. I'm writing a story which, there's certain horrific actions going on. And then as I'm writing almost the last line, I suddenly realize, oh, if I write these extra 5 paragraphs, I can go a whole quantum jump darker and, really catch them on the run, so to speak. Think, I don't know, Sixth Sense, for instance, where it turns out he isn't a ghost, he's actually a demon. That's the sort of direction I could very well end up doing.
So what would the age range be for this story? Because we have some families that listen looking for, their next read. So what do you...
Well, this would be adults, quite honestly. My Shuttlers, for anyone who's interested, is actually aimed at the young adult, 12 to 18-year-olds. I did write it for older people, and the agent said, no, I think this needs to be for younger people. So I rewrote it for younger people. And she looked at him and said, yeah, that'll hit the market. So I have that is written. In fact, last week I was in a local radio interview, and youngster, 12-year-old, I think he was, came in with his mother because they were doing the next program after my interview. And I asked the mother, he said, I said, this is science fiction. Oh, he likes science fiction and fantasy. I said, it's written for young people. And I gave him a copy, and he's promised before he goes back to school in the autumn, he will do a book review on the radio for them.
Nice.
Yeah, so but that was deliberately aimed at younger people. I've written children's stories, sort of, and some of my children's stories can get a little bit dark because you've got to remember that the original fairy tales were very, very dark. I mean, in the original Little Red Riding Hood, she doesn't survive.
Yeah.
Or Cinderella, the ugly sisters are made to put on red hot boots and dance themselves to death. And those were children's stories.
Cautionary tales for sure. Disney has changed our perception of what the fairy tales were.
Oh, very much.
There was a sort of urban paranormal fantasy TV series called Grimm, where they actually started touching on that, and you started seeing like, no, that's just the reality, I guess, of what some of these fairy tales are, and bringing it. It was a cop drama too. It was pretty good if you like that sort of thing. But so, where do you think the ultimate premise for this universe comes from? Like, what was it? Was there a singular moment that inspired it? Was it sort of evolved over time? Like, how did you create this world?
It's evolved over time. As I said, the first story, Michael Sala, the first story in the book, that sort of set the tone, as it were, that, this is a place where weird things happen. People get murdered or not. In fact, the second story starts with a murder of two men by a demon. I had an editor, and she said, oh, you've got to turn this down. You've got to tone this down. You can't have a murder like that. I dropped her for other reasons, found another editor, and her first comment on that story was, you need to turn up the gore. So, this is not a story for kids, but it is a story for adults who enjoy their blood and guts, even though it's not all the way there. I mean, that's probably the darkest, heaviest part of the entire book. But there are others. There's the occasional murder or attempted murder. I've got some really, really strange characters in there, like a descendant of Victor Frankenstein working as a mortician in one story. I've got a ghoul who falls in love with a human in another story. So, I've got a weird and wonderful thing. But these are stories that come out from inside me, and I'm not quite sure always where they come from. It might be someone says something. I mean, in another of my books, somebody told me years ago, my Christmas tree draws blood. And I went, what? And she said, yeah, but there's a particular branch. If she's not careful, when she puts the tinsel on, she scratches her hand, back of her hand, on another branch. And I said, that sounds like something from a horror story. And so she said, so write it. So I did. The story is called Furferatu, which will tell you in what direction I'm probably heading with the story.
Okay, that's dark. So back to Paranormal City, because we've been a little bit all over the place with describing the world. So is this story a collection of shorter stories that
it's
tie
a
together?
collection of shorter stories, but there is an overarching storyline in there. Characters pop in and out of each other's stories, and then the penultimate story, or the last three of the last four stories, all bring it all together under a single, as it were, into a single storyline. It's like the real world. If you've got this character doing his thing and character B doing his thing, and then suddenly later on in the story, then they meet and they're on a quest together, or they are solving a crime together. Sherlock Holmes didn't start out with Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson came to him later when he was looking for rooms. So, the idea is that the characters merge together into a greater story. In the next book, Paranormal City 2, it's called Tales from the Underbelly as a subtitle. And although there is a continuing story going on, it isn't as tightly bound. The story is, it's the characters are coming, but as time goes on, the story and the world is evolving of itself. There's not much I can do about that, actually. It's the world is evolving, and I'm just being dragged along for the ride. Or as somebody once said, I don't write stories. I look at my characters and write up the police incident reports afterwards.
Okay. So what would the 30-second elevator pitch for Paranormal City be then?
Okay, well, this is actually the blurb. Welcome to the city. You'll find everything for your needs, be you vampire, merperson, or one of the living dead. We can cover everything that you want and need to survive in life. Mundanes are also welcome. Just try to fit in.
Okay. So what tropes, since you have so many distinct stories that you then tie together, what kind of tropes can we expect that you sort of put into this collection?
When it comes to tropes, expect that tropes get twisted. I have a vampire story in there about someone who doesn't drink blood. He lives off something else, but he does take a couple of pot shots at the traditional vampires. We've got a story about, for want of a better word, helping hands, someone who has supernatural helping hands, and how that could be a catastrophe if every wish is done as soon as you put it, a bit like letting the genie out. Actually, I do have a story about a genie, but it's not.
Is that in the first one?
Sorry?
Is the genie one in the first collection?
No, it's in a later one. But the idea is, you've got these characters. As I said, there's a ghoul who falls in love with a human. That's actually a Christmas story. And, just these weird and wonderful characters. I've got a werewolf and a werebear. I've got a policeman who's a magician. I have got, I'm just trying to think what else I've got in there. Anyway, I have a rather weird and wonderful set, but as I said, I like to take tropes, mug them down some dark valley, and then kick them while they're down. And in fact, I have a whole section in a book of fairy tales where I take fairy tales and twist them around. Things like Little Red Riding Hood is a homicide detective after an axe murderer, or Cinderella is the nasty one, or one of my stories is called Sleeping Ugly. So, I like to take the ideas and twist them because, we all know the old stories. It's nice to have somebody come along and say, actually, it's this way around instead. And that's what I like to do. I suppose in some of the ways, even some of the stories in here, especially when you read the main story at the end, Going Through Hell, I've had one or two people going, what the hell just happened there, when they meet the savior of the entire city after all hell breaks loose, literally.
So when you wrote the hell stuff, was it inspired by like Dante's Inferno, modern reconceptualization, like the classics of literature? What inspired that section?
Well, actually, yeah, I had recently, it wasn't Dante's Inferno. What I'd recently done was, by accident, I'd reread Inferno by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, which was basically the idea is a science fiction writer goes to hell. But my hell, I don't have the rings, but I do have valleys and places for them to go through. And I also have other punishments, which are not those which you find in Dante. For instance, social climbers. I have special punishments for the gluttonous and so on as they go through, and even a place for gamers. So be warned, any gamers out there, I've already got a place in hell for you.
That's not ominous at all. So do you, because the way you organize this universe with such a collection of disparate sort of stories that you tie together, do you think you're going to have trouble if you tried to branch out to other mediums, be it graphic novels, comics, games, whatever, or do you think it will translate?
I think it will translate. I'd quite like graphic novels. I was introduced about 15 years ago by a friend to graphic novels. I'm an absolute fan of the Sandman and the Lucifer books, for instance, or the graphic novels. I absolutely love them, especially the over-the-top characters like Lucifer himself. I think I absolutely love them, and I think this will probably translate quite well into that sort of thing. In fact, Paranormal City, I have an agent who is looking into movie or TV rights. She's got it out with 4 production companies at the moment. I'll be talking to her hopefully at the weekend and get some feedback on how things are going. Although in these days of the writers and actors strike, that may delay things a bit. But I think the idea has, people like the idea of this a strange place where anything can happen. In some ways, it's almost like a modernization of the Twilight Zone or the Outer Limits or something like that, but in a single place rather than the stories of the others. Each have their own little worlds that they exist in.
So you mentioned the Twilight Zone, and it definitely was giving me sort of vibes of that when you were describing it. But since you mentioned it, did that inspire any of this?
Indirectly. I mean, I only saw occasionally living in Britain, and as I lived for over 30 years, I lived in Switzerland. You didn't get to see that sort of thing. Occasionally, I mean, I think one of the first things I ever saw was the Outer Limits, the Demon with a Glass Hand, which was brilliantly done time travel story as far as I was concerned. But it's more sort of the weird stories I've read over the years, because I've been an absolute fan. I was involved in an anthology called the Fifth Dimension, which was stories similar to the Twilight Zone. I had 3 stories in there. One of them about a little girl meeting a new friend who's a ghost, for instance, or somebody who gets a little boy who wants a pet dog, and he gets a pet dog which is sort of 5 foot high, absolutely black with bright red eyes. Basically, it's a hellhound that doesn't want the job. And again, I like to twist stories around. And that book was it had its day, but I think it's probably I don't know what's going to happen. It hasn't been doing so well recently. I think because there's too many competitors nowadays, including my books.
So with this series, it's available obviously in ebook because everyone does that, and paperback you mentioned, but is this going to be available in audiobook as well?
This is already an audiobook.
Okay. So
you can find it on Audible. It's narrated by Michael Langan, who I think is a brilliant voice actor. He really gives the characters their own lives.
So how did you pick the narrator, given that you have so many points of view?
Well, what it was the publisher, William, said to me, we're going to do this, and he sent me half a dozen auditions. And I went through and I listened to them all. The one I immediately cancelled at the beginning was a woman. I thought she didn't have the right intonation of voice. Then there was an Australian. I thought his accent might cause a few problems for the American listener, which of course is going to be my biggest market. And then a couple of the others, they were okay, but when I heard Michael doing his bit, my brain went, yes, this is the man I want.
So,
because I think in some ways his voice is like the voice in my head when I talk to myself.
okay. So with the difference in spelling and some of the intonation and stuff, did you write it with the American spelling or did you stick with the British spelling? I mean, obviously there's no wrong answer.
I did it with English spelling. William, the publisher, said people like reading books in English because it makes them feel good that they understand it. Don't write for American. I will occasionally use an American word because I know the Americans might not understand. For instance, in England, we talk about a torch, whereas Americans talk about a flashlight. So I will use the word flashlight because it just, as my writing coach and editor said to me, just remember, get rid of your Britishisms. Because there's a great Britishism which you may have come across. It's called OTT. But nobody understands that if they're not British. It means over the top.
Okay.
Okay. So I had to go through, get rid of that. And while I was doing, I found, occasionally, a phrase which is so typically British, but might come across wrong in every other English speaker in the world. So I modified that into a more generic form, as it were, perhaps even with a slight tilt towards the American. But I kept the British spelling, the British grammar for the most part, and it seems to have gone over fine. People seem to love it that way.
Okay, well that's good. Did the narrator that you hired for this novel, was he a British accent then?
Oh yeah, he is British. He is British.
The hardest part for me when I heard my first British narrators, instead of lieutenant, it was lieutenant. They're spelled the same way, but the pronunciation is different.
Yeah.
And sometimes that really can work. Do you read any historic fantasy, or historic fantasy novels?
I have done way back when I used to read the Flashman books.
Okay, so one of the authors that I really enjoy, Mark Allen Idlehite, writes the Steiger's Tiger series, which is basically the idea of what happens if you take the lost Ninth Roman Legion and you stick them smack dab in the middle of Middle Earth, and then the universe builds from there, which is kind of a fun concept. But obviously, in order to convert it, he had some of the sort of British kind of saying, so that way it didn't sound like Americans in Rome. They tried to kind of keep the cultural thing going on. And so when I listen to the narrator reading it and they're pronouncing it that way, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get used to, but I think it adds flavor that'll make you stand out.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that exactly because of that, taking that into account, I do have a character called Lieutenant. Lieutenant Anderson appears in some of the stories, and I deliberately wrote it as Lieutenant because I knew I was aiming primarily at the American market. So I've spelt it the American way. The implication is the place might be in America rather than in Britain, but it's written in such a way, even an Australia might think, yeah, this could be part of Sydney.
Okay.
Okay. So, I'm trying to make this a universal city because, as I say in the introduction, Darktown can be and is anywhere. We just don't know it's there. It could be hiding in plain sight. In some village, it's the pub that nobody ever goes to, but always seems to be very, very busy.
Okay. So what the city, right? Well, before we're running on time, but so the city is its own character. So when you go there, if you were going to go get a meal, what kind of food would we expect? Are we talking fish and chips, American New York style pizza?
Well, there is actually a restaurant I've mentioned a couple of times called the Grim Grimoire, and they specialize. You can get anything from the demonic to the cannibalistic. They even have a collection of shale and granite for the trolls to eat and so on. Mundanes can eat there, but you're probably only going to end up with hamburger and chips or Caesar salad. But ask for the straight option because you might find pieces of Caesar in your salad otherwise.
Okay. Okay. Do you have like what kind of creatures can we expect in this world? You've mentioned some, but I mean, we're talking ghosts, goblins. You mentioned trolls, dwarves, elves. Like what's the gamut?
Well, basically, they all exist there. In this story, and well, in this book, you've got vampires. You've got a ghost who helps the policeman, by the way. You've got let's see, vampires. There's a giant, werewolves, werebears, magicians, phantom hands.
Oh,
That's just a few. In later stories, in later books, you've got blood-sucking trees. You've got a djinn who is an alcoholic, so he tends to misinterpret things. I haven't done a mummy story yet, but I have done a couple of variations on werewolves. You see, my werewolves, they are actually a separate species. They are not people who have been bitten. That's lycanthropes, and they have got a whole different problem. But werewolves are a different species that just happen to be able to change shape into humans. You see, a werewolf is a wolf first and a human second. Same with a werebear, by the way.
okay. So
again, I like to take a trope and turn it upside down.
okay. So how much of your understanding of the weird and wacky kind of creatures that you throw in there, how much of it is true to what people would recognize, and how much of it is Stephen Oliver's take on it? Like, is there a
well, let's put it this way. Somebody, I was reading one of my stories out, and somebody said, I love the way you start off in the normal world and then you just drop a hint that things aren't quite what they seem, and then another hint, and before you know it, we're in a completely different world with completely different ideas, and we didn't even see you dragging us in. Like in another story of mine, where I talk about a guy's talking about his partner, their police, his partner, and I mentioned the fact that his partner, he clenched his fist and both thumbs on his fist closed over it, and he went green. Well, because he's actually not a human. But the point is, I've got this. I don't actually say he's not human until later on, but there are hints there that something isn't quite what you think it is. And that's what I like to do. I like to draw the people in so they come in thinking, oh, it's going to be just a mildly fantastic story. And when they're deep in it, I give them a whammy and they realize, oh God, I'm in the middle of, a horror, not maybe a horror story, but in a story where nothing is what it should be, and I've got to be careful that I'm going to walk out of here again. In fact, one reviewer said I survived the city, but only just.
Okay, is the entire there's obviously more than one city in this world. Are all the cities like that, or is this city special somehow?
This is, I think, in some ways, in my view, all the cities have similarities. They've all got their weird and wonderful, but this is probably the true city. Have you ever read Michael Moorcock, The Champion Eternal?
I've read some of it, yes, sir.
So you know about Tanalorn?
I do. I haven't read it in a while. But...
Or Amber in the Amber stories. This is probably the true city from which all the other ones derive. This is a city that's been here since the beginning of time and will probably still be here when the world comes to an end. It's for want of a better word, the city, the true city where everything else derives from it. So, it's been there forever. It will be there forever. But when you wander in, you may not recognize it because it's not the same city that you visited the last time. And that's what I like to do with my stories. Different aspects come out and you think, am I in the same place at all? In fact, I say this city is rumored to be at the center of the multiverse, where you can go anywhere, anywhen, any which.
Okay, so does that make it difficult for you to keep track of everything?
I leave that up to my muse, my subconscious, because one thing I do know is my subconscious knows what it's doing. This story I mentioned earlier was 2,500 words long, and I suddenly had to put it up to. Something happened at the very beginning of that story. Someone did something, and even as I wrote it and the reaction to it, I was thinking, what was that? What is going on here? And it's not until you come to the end of the story, 14,000 words later, that you realize what that meant. It was a foreshadowing across the whole length of the story of something earth-shattering. Now, when I originally wrote it, I wasn't going to write the whole story. I was only going to write a short thing, 2,500 words. But my subconscious had already got that whole story. That's why when I sat down to write it, I could write 12,000 words in 3 days, because my story had already been finished in the back of my head. It was less a case of creating the story and more a case of writing it down. A bit like Robert E. Howard saying when he wrote his Conan stories, he sometimes felt that Conan was sitting behind him with his hand on his shoulder, telling his stories, his memoirs. And sometimes it feels a bit like that. The story, the world exists in the back of my head, and I'm just writing what goes on in there.
Okay. So, was there, we've been a little bit all over the place, but that's the fun of this new interview style, dear listener. But was there anything that we didn't ask that you think, the listeners and viewers need to know about this Paranormal City to clinch the deal for them to decide to click the button in the show notes and buy this book?
Well, as I said, it's only the beginning. There's much more to come. Some of the characters have got their own stories to come. Some of the characters you meet in here have got their own stories, or appear in other people's stories. This is a world I'm giving you, and this is just the first chapter of that world. And I'm hoping that people might enjoy it enough and enjoy my weirdness enough, because I must admit I am very weird. Even my mother admits that. I'm going to keep going. I have already written in all my various stories 1.4 million words in the last 10.5 years since I started writing. And my intention is to keep going for as long as possible. I may actually have to have a literary executor or whatever it is to make sure that the last of my stories go out, but I'm not going to stop. This is only the beginning.
Okay. This is only the beginning. That sounds like an ominous way to end an episode. So with that being said, dear listener, this is the important part where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book, so do your part. It's especially impactful for a new author like Stephen, newly published author like Stephen, since he's been writing for a while. And it really does help, and it helps you sell the book that you're passionate about to other readers, and sort of encourages them to keep publishing more, because his publisher is not a charity, and if it doesn't sell, there aren't going to be more, because editing isn't free. Those editors need to eat too, apparently. They don't just live off crushing our hopes and dreams by editing my sentences. Wait a minute. Maybe I'm projecting just me. So with that being said, Stephen, where can listeners and viewers find you if they wanted to find out more?
Well, actually, I'm right in the middle of revising my webpage. You can go on there, but it's going to be a bit changeable over the next few weeks as I finish the work. And that is www.stephenoliver, Stephen with a PH, please, -author.com. As I said, I am revising it. I have a blog on there. I have links to all the books I've been involved with. So, they can find, because I've been published in, I think, 20 anthologies.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. If you're going to go out there with the weird and wonderful, you have to establish your credentials, as it were. So appearing in published anthologies by other people, that is a good way to start. And when you can say, look, here's a list of all my anthologies I've been involved in, and they can go and look and say, oh yeah, I like that story. Or, you'll have to look on my Amazon page, or on my blog, because there, you see I've actually been pretty active, and you have to do something. And so you can find me there. I'm also on Twitter. I have 2 accounts there. One is author Stephen O, which is my general purpose one. And I've recently started a new one, Stephen_author, which is purely for my writing world. And you can find me there. And I'm on Facebook, but there I talk about anything and everything from politics up or down.
Okay. And you can find us, dear listener, on our link tree, which is linktr.ee. So linktree / Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, linktree / Blasters and Blades podcast. We link our BitChute, our Rumble, and all the things, but those specifically there, since other competitor platforms don't like it when you link to their competitors. Speaking of, we have a Twitter at twitter.com / SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. If they ever change Twitter's domain to X or whatever the shifting sands of Elon's mind are, we will keep SF_fantasy_show. So just, keep that in mind. We're going to keep that sci-fi and fantasy show. It works for us. We have an email at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We do answer all of your emails. So send us a letter, send us recommendations of who you want on the show. Tell me I talk too fast. Hey, they called me Motormouth as a kid for a reason. And if you're old enough, I used to try to keep up with the Micro Machine guy who did the auctioneer voice where he spoke really fast. I tried to keep up with him once. But yeah, so send us an email. We have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen at facebook.com /groups /Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, /groups /Blasters and Blades podcast. We have a Facebook page where we also link to all of our episodes. We link to book reviews and all the things. So look for it, sign it, like it. It does not have its dedicated URL yet. I will work with Doc and coordinate that. I think we have enough followers. But just to be sure, if you want to hit like and follow that, we would greatly appreciate it. We also have a website at anchor.fm /blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm /blasters-and-blades, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Speaking of, you can also join the discussion on Spotify with the questions and answer portion of the episodes where we've started linking when we put them up. So you can join the, answer the polls, answer questions, participate that way. If that's your preference, we would enjoy that. And you can also support the show more directly on buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. I promise I will keep be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly caffeinated. They will drink until their mind is as warped as Steven's, and maybe they will understand his level of weirdness by then. But I don't know if there's enough coffee in the world for that, sir. That's probably good for you for job security.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. We appreciate you coming by, Stephen, and we'll have to have you back for some of our panels on the weird and wacky in fiction, because that could be an interesting discussion. And if we get a few more like you, we might, break the internet or something.
Well, I'd certainly be glad to come back, because you may be a motor mouth, but I used to be called Ratchet Jaw, which is the same thing.
I dig it. All right. I'm going to add that to my repertoire now. Thank you for coming by. I appreciate it, sir.
Thank you.